Sajid reply, no particular gender pronouns.
Cool. Thank you so much. Before we begin, I think we have many observers in the room. Please do not use the chat by any means. Second of all, speakers, before each speech, if you can do a quick mic check, am I audible? If you don't have background noise, if we can clearly hear you, that will be useful. Thirdly, I will be typing in the chat the timing after first 6-7 minutes. If I will unmute myself, that means that we are going over 7:30, which means we can't make any notes. If someone will start losing the connection, like that will be shaking, just type firstly in the chat. So we will try to stop the debate immediately, to not unmute yourself unless it's completely unnecessarily. Lastly, before we begin, this is the open quarterfinal. There might be a lot of emotions. Please remember to be respectful towards each other. And without further ado, good luck for all of the participants. And I think, Prime Minister, whenever you are ready, you can begin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. All good.
Okay.
But if you can speak a bit louder, that will be definitely preferential.
Is this better?
I think so. If anyone will have any issues, just please type in the chat, but I think should be fine.
Okay, thank you. I'm sadly I won't be able to turn on my camera because there are other people in the room. Ready. I prefer POIs in the chat, but if I'm not answering at around the 5 mark or 5:30 mark, you can turn on your camera and wave at me so that I don't forget, because sometimes I forget. So. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What is inherent to sin, being seen as a temptation of the devil, is that it assumes that people are inherently good, that people always have the best intentions and they only slip up every now and then. Therefore, we should give them a pass, or therefore we should be more forgiving, etc., etc. I think the difference is on our side of the house is that when sin is no longer a result of temptation, you directly attribute a lot of the harm and a lot of the strife, for example, that was caused by an action to this particular individual, and would say that it's a much preferable world to live in. I'm going to be running two things in my speech. First, why the religion or religions, for example, that use temptation as a model forces individuals into bad situations. And secondly, where we preempt any ideas about buy-in. Why do we think people are still likely to engage in religions, and why do we think it's actually more fulfilling for these individuals at the end of the day? Before I move on to that, I want to make very clear the model coming from government. In our world, I think sin is attributed entirely to the choice of an individual. It is not that the devil tempts good people, but that people choose evil, and this stems from things like internal strife and motivation to be selfish. We prefer a world where the stories in religion, for example, about sin are structured around human agency. So things like snakes tempting, like Adam and Eve, or Satan tempting Jesus in the desert, will be restructured in such a way that it specifically talks about the agency of those individuals and whether or not they chose to sin at that point. I think as a consequence, there is more of an understanding in these religions of assigning blame onto individuals that can be held accountable. So I think, for example, in that point, to be forgiven, you would need to, for example, to make up for a lot of the losses that you have caused other individuals, because they recognize that the loss that people felt is not the result of some tangible thing that we cannot hold accountable, but rather this individual itself. So I think to be forgiven is likely going to focus on reparations to the victims in question, and, for example, serving time for all of the things that you've done. I think this is the way that narrative is shifted in regards to how we forgive individuals. I think in this world, it is likely to be seen that everyone can be evil, but also everyone can be good, rather than being supposedly more exposed to temptation due to certain contexts that you live in. And I think at that point, you impose structures that make them choose, you make it easier to choose good. And that's what I'll be running in this speech. First, why religions force individuals into bad situations. I want to flag that organized religions in our world may have more genuine buy-in, as well, more genuine belief, like a belief, for example, for the way that it is structured, and that makes religions better overall. But let's take a look about religions on their side. Why is the devil, or having the devil, why is having the devil as a model of temptation oppressive to people? First, it forces individuals into thinking that human nature is fickle and that they always ought to have a mediator to provide. I think that in itself is bad for how we interpret our own agency and interpret our place in the world. But secondly, I think you are associated, or a lot of things like temptation are heavily associated to the context of an individual. So for example, if you have a lower socioeconomic position, it means it usually assumes that you are more exposed to things like temptation. I think at that point, these individuals are forced to opt into religions because they don't feel like they have any other choice. So while I agree that there might be more people, for example, that opt into religion on the side of opposition, I would contend that this, like, the opting in is inherently, for example, coercive because of all of the context that that is believed to be things like temptation. But thirdly, I think you also allow or like compel these individuals to forgive their oppressors for the fact that the evil that they caused or the evil that these victims experienced was not a result of this individual, but rather the result of a third party that we cannot take control over. This makes religion harmful in three ways. First, you are unable to address actual sources of evil in the world because notice how the church now, the way that it tries to propagate good, like things like big charity events and all these things, don't actually address a lot of the structural strife that people experience that are usually the result of individuals. For example, CEOs of large corporations that are manipulative, or politicians, for example, that are genuinely corrupt. A lot of these things are not tackled in the current model, for example, of religions. But secondly, they fear the devil overwhelmingly. Notice on the side of opposition, you have every incentive to make sure that they make the devil look like he's overwhelming with their temptation such that you continuously subscribe to the religion. This is bad for people who feel like they are exposed the most to temptation, like in like lower socioeconomic situations. I think this causes individuals to also feel lost and like question, for example, if they have the capacity to even like overturn or even oppose all of this temptation because it exists in such proliferation around them. Why is the alternative better? First, on our side, you have people that will help you look and seek justice. This is particularly good for people that would otherwise not have communities to fight for them, like minorities, for example, who don't have the resources. I think this looks like putting people who unjustly oppressed you, for example, on trial. I think a lot of the church, for example, and these communities are more likely to help you in that respect. But I think it also can result in an institutional level and not necessarily just the individual injustices that you feel. Notice that in our like model, I think people in power, whether you be like a church leader or whether you are a believer in power, maybe you're a politician or a CEO, you now have the incentive to make doing good a far easier thing to do. Because first, you also benefit from the structure changing and making good an easier thing to do. And for the fact that you know that it's a result of your agency and not that you are naturally good. So you need to create these structures to make it easier for you. Examples include making, for example, more NGOs that specifically tackle things like structural injustices, or for example, campaigning for things like more egalitarian criminal justice systems that are genuinely more fair and genuinely easier for individuals on the ground to opt into doing good. Before I move on, POI. POI?
Sorry, yeah. So what exactly are you defending as retribution? Because presumably you have to defend Sharia law levels of retribution, where if you steal, your arms are cut off. You think that's a fair world to live in?
Okay, so I don't think this is true because like notice how, for example, even in any like kinds of retribution or any way that you hold people accountable, even in the current structure of sin, they don't typically ask you to do these things. I would contend though, for example, the way that we would do it is maybe you do have to go to jail if you were if you did something that was bad. You have to go to jail, for example, if you killed someone, if you stole from someone, etc., etc. So I think we're willing to take those kinds of things, but I don't think it doesn't necessarily go to the extreme in all these cases. But secondly, I'm going to talk about buy-in because I feel like opposition might challenge us in the respect that people no longer opt into your religion because the church will condemn you. I think this is untrue because the church generally has the incentive to make sure their followers are good individuals. Otherwise, they're not a very good church. They would want to make sure that the individuals consistently subscribe to them because they are able to do good, for example, such that they can gain the salvation that they promise. I think additionally, there's more satisfaction now in being able to do good and opposing evil because you recognize that it comes from your own agency and was not a stroke of luck that the devil was not tempting you at this point. So I think any idea about condemnation is neutralized for this response for the fact that you also gain more satisfaction when you do good on our side of the bench. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Prime Minister for that fine speech. We are ready to call Leader of the Opposition to continue.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, all good. Just check if you are not echoing by any chance. Can you repeat? Yes, all good. I think someone was just unmuted.
Sure. Just give me a few seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think proposition can beat around the bush and debate about things like good, or debate about things like retribution in the lenient, like the most lenient form. But what they ultimately need to defend are societies where religion is often the most strictest, in the most strictest form, where these forms of human agencies will literally be decided to excommunicate or give people the harshest forms of punishment. Unless they defend that, I don't think government is going to win this debate. A few things in terms of context to truly give you an idea of where this debate is essentially happening. Recognize that when we talk about Abrahamic religion, these are religions where the forms of punishment are literally the most brutal. These are often religions, for example, Islam, which literally looks after an eye for eye justice form, where Sharia law, for instance, asks, like in Saudi Arabia, like thieves, the hands of the thieves are cut off literally because it's seen as an eye for eye justice. The most retributive and most severe forms of justice take place in these forms of conservative societies, even in these parts of societies today. The reason why religion has to a large extent moderated in a lot of societies where religion is not served out as an eye for eye punishment, or where Sharia law is not affected, are states where decentralized imams are allowed to make more moderate fatwas, where they're allowed to tell individuals that certain sins are not your own human agency, but rather things that we should be more forgiving towards, because individuals are often prone to individuals are often exploited by the devil. We think without that form of a narrative, if you prefer a world where human agency is the only deciding factor, you need to defend the worst forms of human agency usage with regards to justice. If side government doesn't do that, most of their arguments are automatically framed up. But to a large extent, a lot of their arguments don't really make sense, right? Because I think to a large extent, a lot of their arguments, such as like holding these individuals accountable, will still happen in our side of the house. It's not like we're going to forgive them outright. But more importantly, I don't think this debate necessarily has to be about good. Most other engagements will be integrated within my argument. But the first thing I want to talk about is why moderation with regards to the pushing the blame on devil is fine. Because look at places like Bangladesh, Brunei, Malaysia. Both state and community justice has moved away from Sharia. This has happened because we've allowed the reinterpretation of Islam. The basis is that sin is deterministic in nature. This has led to multiple more moderations because we attribute sin to the devil. We give individuals second chances. We tell individuals that it is the devil's fault. We need to move them away from devil rather than making religious a binary. What does this look like? This looks like religious rehab centers within these areas, or welcoming sinners within prisons, to making them a part of religious forums where we talk about religion and try to bring them to a better path, as opposed to direct retributive justice. Why is this the most important framing of this debate? Because recognize that human beings are victims of circumstances that they live in because of the deterministic nature of the world. This is often why poor individuals are most likely to steal, because their circumstances forces them to be. Victims of political circumstances are most likely to resort to violence. All of these things, when you look at it from an eye of human agency, we will likely punish them for already being victims in these sorts of scenarios. The comparative is, under our side of the house, we take their circumstances into account and we don't punish them. We don't make them go through a double-edged sword. For all of these reasons, we think the comparative is far better. So with regards to this argument, we think when you make your own choice, the sort of things that, for example, religions such as Islam preach is that you are often tagged as a kafir because these are individuals who are considered more powerful than God because they managed to escape the realms of God and managed to take up their own human agency to defy God. These are individuals who are shown absolutely zero sympathy and are often excommunicated, killed off, or punished in the most brutal forms of way. The comparative is stories under our side of the house, these things are framed as sins, or these things are framed as guna, for example, in Islam, which is seen as, for instance, the devil is forcing you to do these things. The interpretation is we are all prone to things like devil. So when government tells you that they prefer a world where stories of, let's say, Adam and Eve are that human agency is to blame, it is far different from a world where you're most likely to empathize with people, because the best stories about the best human beings, for example, Adam and Eve in Christianity, are seen as like human beings who were forced by devil to make certain mistakes. We think as human beings or as individuals within a religious society, we're likely to be far more empathetic. This is most important because this applies to the strictest forms of religious societies such as Bangladesh, Pakistan. This does not apply to like Catholic societies within Germany, because often these are societies which literally make religion or punishment based on the binary determination between whether or not you are a kafir or you're a religious person. We think that is essentially why this is by far more important. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is why we think inclusion in society is far better served in our side of the house. When people who don't abide by religion what happens to people who don't abide by religion or need time to gradually move away or need an option to like lead their life? We think often it is far more coercive under their side of the house. Who do we protect under our side of the house? Think about women who at the age of 14, for instance, for the first time feel like they want to boycott the hijab or they want to dress differently, or LGBTQI individuals who for the first time recognize that they want to change the way in their lifestyles, who are making subtle changes in their lives. What do these individuals need? Often they need protection until they become adults and become self-sufficient or capable of protecting themselves. This looks like individuals going into university, getting away from home, having their own income to sustain themselves if their parents boycott them, or they need to have the opportunity to move out of their isolated community. Why does life become harder for these individuals? 3 reasons under this. First, we think the threshold is far lower when you for these individuals for rehabilitation. Often, when your parents realize that you are responsible for your crime, they see it as a means to take ownership. Because when it's devil, your parents look through stories of themselves, of how they were also like prone to the devil's influence. But now it's their own control, or the human agency, they see it as their own human like evolution or something. So for all of these reasons, they're likely to be far more aggressive in the way that they discipline you. The second, the rhetoric becomes binary. You're constantly asked whether or not you are a kafir or you're a Muslim. But under our side of the house, it is far less vitriolic in nature, where you are given more time to rehabilitate, where you're allowed to live within a spectrum where certain parts of religion you can reconcile with, but other parts you can't. The impact is simple. Either these individuals are super afraid, which makes them more closeted, more shunned away from their society, and they need to live a double life with constant dissonance, where they become more depressed, or they become excommunicated. For a lot of these individuals, they live within perpetual dissonance, where they constantly feel like they are the ones who are at fault for not abiding by religion because human agency is to blame. We think all of these individuals blame themselves and life becomes significantly worse for them. These individuals are far more included in our side of the house. For all of these reasons, we win the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Leader of the Opposition. We are ready to call DPM to continue the debate.
Hello, testing my microphone. Can I be heard properly?
Yeah, all good.
All right, sure. Thank you. So, hello. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. I'm gonna watch POIs in the chat. That's my preference. So if you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat and I'm gonna accept it from the chat. Okay. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Individuals are made to believe that they live in sin, that the life and sin is a condition and a status that they cannot opt out of, because the devil will always be there, because it always tries to tempt and corrupt your conscience and make some people more evil and weaker than other individuals for no other reason than that the devil is just freaking crazy. This is a world that not only just passes and ignores evil acts, but it ignores evil and actual manifestations of evil in the world itself. When opposition tries to say that they want a world where people can opt for forgiveness and opt for change and rehabilitation, that paradigm can only exist in a system that is contingent on free will and agency, and not only contingent on saying that people are inherently good, that people are just gonna do good and can be trusted to do good because they believe in God, because God is gonna be for them, because they can wait for the permission for a priest to just forgive their sins. No, that is not a just world. That is not a fair world, and that is not the world that we support in this debate. My argument today is going to be very simple. I'm going to talk about hope and redemption and why that matters, and why salvation that is hinged and on free will and agency makes for a better and just world. Before this, a few points of rebuttal. So I want to initially rebut this entire conception that is being forced to us by opposition to say that we should defend the world of Sharia law and of a fundamentalist world where everyone is going to cut off their hands and do everything that they want because the organized religion will just tell you to do that because they're going to punish you to do bad things and all of these things. I have three levels of response to make this debate very clear. The first response is I just want to make it very clear, right? It is contingent, and it is important to understand that the ways in which religions and Abrahamic religions will structure themselves is that they always still want to get followers on either side. There is always some level of coercion in both sides of this world, as conceded by Prime Minister. But to the extent that they will coerce individuals to opt into religion, what is the understanding of human agency? What is the understanding of evil and good? And we said that a way in which people will try and attribute blame and responsibility to other individuals also says that you are capable of doing evil, but you are also more so equally capable of always doing good because you can discern that good for yourself, and it's not only dependent on a god, not only dependent on the devil, and not only dependent on a priest. Why is this important as part of framing? Because when opposition says you need a judge to mediate that, that actually isn't the only full fruition of our world. The full fruition of understanding in our world of heaven and hell, and also religion and its role in society and how people understand their faith, is in terms of trying to create fair, just structures that try and attribute blame fairly towards more and more individuals. Why are these true? Because one, religions will want to compete each other for more followers, and many religious followers will choose the religion that is fairest to them as they understand it. Because when they commit a bad act, they know that God should punish them justly. Or if they could do a good act, God should punish them, not punish them, reward them in a fair manner that is also proportional. Where is this better? In our world with free agency and free will. But what is the comparative in their world? This is the second response. In a world that relies on evil being determined by the temptation of the devil, it says that most individuals are not in control of their good and bad actions. This is an important framing because they say they want rehabilitation. They want people to turn away from the devil, but that is only contingent insofar as you show that people are fully in control of that good. If they are not in control of that good or not in control of the devil in that circumstance, then the delta has to be better on our side for people to try and be able to choose good more so often in our world. That is the reparative structures that Irene talked about, the ability for people to pay their victims what they actually owe to them, or for religious structures to actually impose blame on other individuals. Yes, there's going to be some level of blame, but blame is always going to be symmetric to the extent that people believe in heaven and hell in either side of the house. What is the difference? In medieval times, probably in their world, people, or at least in the world that exists today, people were probably blamed for being demonic. People were probably blamed for being of the devil or living in sinful conditions, like LGBT community, or like women, for example, that were always executed in medieval times. That is probably how people were structuring that understanding in their world. But the delta in our side is that people will not exaggerate the devil as being overwhelming and uncontrollable for the vast majority of circumstances of people in this world. So the delta in our world is that people can interpret scripture in better ways that are more just for themselves. Like Sodom and Gomorrah can just be about an understanding of being more hospitable to more strangers, instead of just saying that they are inherently evil or inherently bad on the basis of whether or not they were tempted by the devil, for example, or saying that Adam and Eve were not just weak representations of humanity and saying that they were fallible and just weak-spirited, because on the basis of people can still be blamed of being weak-spirited today because they don't always turn towards the good. This is better because people can attribute that good and attribute that evil towards themselves by using it in terms of their own own fulfillment in their world. So I think that's a better way to do that. So the last response then is this: yes, we are fine with having some sort of punishment and reward system in our world, because to the extent that heaven already does that today in this world, we don't want a devil that is unrestricted or controlled by the organized religion that interprets it for these individuals to make it less and less accessible for people to do the good or to punish evil in their world. Yes, TKPY.
Do you think more people are prone to being perceived as sinners from positions of power or from positions of weakness?
Oh, wait, so I think like the best way to do that is in terms of the choices that people do. And obviously, more individuals in power have more control over the choices to do more evil things. More people in poorer conditions have lesser control to do those evil things, and therefore are probably going to be perceived as being able and capable to do grassroots good things. Like the story of saying, like, a poor individual can donate $1 to the church, and that is so powerful and meaningful that for that person, because there is hope in being able to try and attain that forgiveness and salvation. Their side says that all individuals are tempted by the devil in asymmetric ways on that basis of power, and you cannot say that people will pursue an egalitarian world on their side. So just some hope and redemption just for people for their personal reflection. Opposition lives in a world where hope is easier to lose and where evil persists and exists in many ways. One, salvation in their world is contingent on God redeeming that type of salvation for themselves and redeeming them from the devil. You have to tell in confession and in baptism that you are, erase and wash away original sin. You have to renew your vows in confession or in whatever types of sacraments you do over and over again. Salvation here is not in your control. It is subdued and controlled by God, controlled by the priests and other individuals. We give people that agency. Having just faith-based alone or asymmetric, types of opt-in to your religion is just not fair. People will be disillusioned by evil. They will not be in control of that evil, and they will be overwhelmed by that evil. Our side changes that. Very proud to post.
Thank you very much to DPM for that speech. We are ready to call the allowed to continue the debate.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'll get.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Unengaged piece of material from Wafi's speech, which is presumably a debate winning. It's that the most vulnerable people who want to dissent from religion need that safe space at a critical juncture of their life, that delaying the action from religion and imposing their will on them, both from families and from communities, is offset by that extra 3 or 4 years. This looks like women who want to not wear the hijab. This looks like LGBT individuals who want to dress differently. This is evidenced by the fact that communities like us, where we come from religious families, can hide the fact that a lot of people within our own debate society are atheists up until the point where we move into university and can isolate. This would be a world where they would not let us get education at all because they see us as being one that is a kafir and is going against God. That's how strong that line of attack could be. And that's how we protect the most vulnerable individuals within these communities. Unengaged wins us the debate anyway. Where do they try to engage? They try to engage and say that the best kind of justice is one that is retributive to those who cause sin. The first premise that we also asked in a POI is, who are likely to cause more sin in the eyes of religious people? It is extremely unlikely that those in positions of power are going to be seen as sinners as much. This is because of the following structural reasons. Number one, people in positions of power can hide crimes much better. This is because oftentimes they have a lot of information hegemony, where you can control the kinds of information that is disseminated by religious leaders and their doings within communities. So they're often only the people who are like their second hand or third hand and like in line to become the next imam have access to their personal lives in the first place. Number two, they can interpret religion by themselves and can use that to justify a lot of actions contextually that a lot of vulnerable people can't. Number three, we think these people are also less likely to be distrusted because the burden that you have to convince people through is much higher. Because once you already trust individuals in positions of power, it's less likely that that trust will be broken. So the first premise is that the context in which Gav is debating is less likely to apply because you won't catch crimes or immorality in the vast majority of cases to begin with. Secondly, even if you catch these people committing immoral acts, you often lose legitimacy if you are prone to the devil at multiple points of your life. So if you're a pedophilic church, priest, and you get caught in pedophilia 3 or 4 times, your legitimacy as a priest reduces within the Catholic Church hierarchy because you're more prone to the devil. You're more weak an individual. And therefore, even if you don't buy the spiritual analysis through which you have less appeal, the tangible political analysis is it makes less political sense for the church to promote you to the bishop position when there are alternatives competing for the same position as well. Third, even if this person is prosecuted for the crime right now, it is in absence of the devil, where you say, I made a mistake, I'm really sorry, get done with it, maybe have some version of compensation where you try to atone for it and give some money to the victim you hurt. But right now, even if it's not one victim, here's the trade-off or the marginal trade-off. Right now, even if you don't catch these people, you recognize that the devil is a real threat. If you catch these people, you recognize that it's an even bigger threat than you initially imagined, which is it can influence priests as well. What this means is you recognize as a religion that the devil is everywhere and everyone needs protection and no one is free from it. That is what is likely to influence the greatest amount of investment into protecting the most vulnerable individuals from the devil. This looks like building up schools in communities that otherwise have no education so that they're less prone to the devil. This looks like making sure people are getting welfare so that they don't sin and are not caught by the devil in a position of weakness. None of that religious investment, which happens in most vulnerable societies that the states often leave behind, would have happened. The fourth layer of analysis is, even if you don't do this, it's not like just because the devil influenced you, that God is never going to spiritually forgive you or will never care about it. Regardless of which world we operate in, God still cares about those who want to be in line with what God gives you. So there's always a positive incentive for you to not be influenced by the devil and not be caught randomly doing bad things and asking forgiveness. So the positive incentive of religion always influences religious leaders who also portray things like heaven and also portray rewards to continuously show good acts in what they do. So that's a flip of what they're talking about as well, which is why the vast majority of this debate does not happen in the way in which Gov would portray. They also ignore the most conservative and the most vulnerable societies where victims are likely to be poor individuals who don't have the political capital that religious leaders or people in positions of power do. These look like individuals who are prosecuted for stealing from the rich that have religious clergy influence. Those are the kinds of people that decentralized imams with fatwas can protect, none of which can ever happen when you delineate between kafir and religious and have no in-between guna, people who are sinners but can be fixed. That's the kind of people we want to protect. The next line of analysis is this weird stuff about Abrahamic faiths having an incentive to always better themselves because of this. The first thing I'd like to say is that's presumably not the debate, because we don't change the way in which this debate applies to non-believers, because non-believers presumably don't care about the devil as well. Of course, this debate cannot happen on a comparative for non-believers. It's about people existentially as a part of the faith already. Neither side influences them. The second thing to analyze is most people often can't opt out of religion because it's a strong indoctrination that your family has gone through, your community has gone through. So saying that you can pick and choose is much easier said in debates than in reality, when you literally have to leave your communities behind or you have to feel like you're betraying your parents. POI.
Rich people on your side are assumed to be inherently good because their lifestyles in itself
Are
are
assumed to be
also free from temptation. This then passes the blame to people who are poor, who are full of, whose lives are full of temptation at that point.
No, because presumably, even if they have temptation, the attribution of that temptation is not to them, but to an external actor called the devil. In your side, the temptation is a constant, which is why you then blame them for the temptation. Unless you presumably say that temptation goes away or prove that poor people suddenly start acting differently, I don't think you're winning this debate. The other thing to suggest is mediators are likely to be required in both worlds. Here's where our analysis comes in. It's about individuals who themselves will act in perpetual ways regardless. So even if certain people start changing or acting differently, the way humans operate is through confirmation bias. So if Ahmadiyyas in Pakistan act in a particular way, you will blame the entire community for the action of one individual because you have that confirmation bias, that genetic composition means everyone acts in the same way, or because political leaders tell you to believe that because they have political incentives of isolation. Our world changes that for the better, because at least you know that regardless of this community acting in a particular way, it's not because of them. So for the first time, you can transition acceptance from a local level to a mass scale level. When you blame human autonomy for that, you continuously isolate communities. And that's something we can't ever have.
Thank you very much. And it's time for Government Web.
Hello, just setting up my timer, but testing if my audio is audible and clear.
Yes, all good, loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, now. OP cannot win this debate because on the metric of they only think that our policy only applies to poor people. But a lot of these structures that make you skeptical of human choices, that attribute sin to the person who does this, can also be blamed to rich people as well at the point in which they do wrong choices as well. If you agree that the privileged can hide their wrongdoings more easily on either sides, we say this is harmful because on OP's side, you genuinely think that people are inherently good. If you say that the privileged people are better at hiding their wrongdoings, you will always assume that these choices and their lives that they lived are inherently good, and you become less skeptical of what they do. So when DLO comes here and tells us he wants distrust among people and you want to hold people accountable, it's harder to do that on opposition because if you say that you are heavily influenced by evil, the kinds of retributions and the kinds of like accountability you demand from people can be lessened through confession, can be lessened through things like baptism and just be being faithful, but not really trying to retribute the kinds of sin and the kinds of wrongdoings that you have already committed. So if you want distrust and you want skepticism among the choices of rich people as well, we say you do that under government where you are skeptical of the human choices as a whole, which doesn't only apply to the poor people in this debate. The first thing I want to do is answer where is religion more fulfilling to its followers, and the second is answer where do we get less exploitative religions, because they seem to try to win this debate on this argument of the poorer societies and stricter religions. On the first issue then, where is religion more fulfilling to its followers? They never rebutted the idea that you are more fulfilled if you know that you are in control of the things that you do, and you do not attribute these kinds of good doings to the church alone or to your religion alone because you know that you played an active role. But they say, what about those people in poverty and those that are influenced by their circumstance to commit sin? 3 responses to this. The first thing that they then respond to is the overwhelming narrative that the devil is strong, which I think wins the debate because of 2 impacts. First, the disillusionment or the demotivation that you create among your followers, especially the ones in the most vulnerable circumstances that are likely to create these sins, they never mechanize why those people are likely to do good, or in a prefers world, why mechanisms to help people do more good choices will exist on their side. I would say it is less likely for these followers and people in these religions to make an effort to make good choices because you're not in control, and whatever you do can be tempted by evil. So if this debate happens in the most exploitative countries and the most poor circumstances, we say they have no mechanization as to how they make these people do good choices. We say they rationalize all those sinful behaviors because you say you're tempted by evil and not tempted by real structural choices that people make in society. The second response is, if you want people to introspect why they make these choices for themselves, for example, or if you want to make these people do good choices in general, you feel more empowered to do so when they know that they can, and they know that they have the capacity to do good things, and not overpowered and not heavily influenced by the devil's power. The reason why that cannot exist on op, even if people will still sin on government, it is less likely for them to do these sins over and over again because they know that the sin is directly attributed to them. Presumably, if all these poor people are under the religion and are heavily indoctrinated because they get fulfillment from religion, it is easier to make these people do good choices in the future because they know that sinning again cannot be attributed to an arbitrary their head or the arbitrary evil from the church, but are directly attributable to them. But the second impact to this that they never responded to coming from Luigi is when you try to change structures, it is more likely for you to want to do so because you know that you can, because you know that you have control and you can use your choices to overcome these kinds of things. You are more likely to blame people in power because their choices led to the evil that you face now, and not just an arbitrary circumstance that the devil imposed on you. Before the second question, POI.
Good is a wash in this debate because the positive incentives for good are equal in both worlds. Sin cannot influence what you do for good unless you're talking about compensation for sin, which we've proven with education investment, and we've proven with the willingness to get forgiveness from God.
So the first response to that is, you never proved why these structures that make it easy for people to do good will still exist in opposition. If you believe that people are already fundamentally good in op, we say that you only make structures that make people do more good choices if you believe that their sins are attributable to them and you want to prevent those sins as much as possible. The second thing I want to rebut in that POI is they assume that we won't have education or liberal education on our side. We say it's even more likely on government because you know that your conscience is directly influenced by all these structures and all the education you get, compared to an opposition where you already assume that people are inherently good. You are less likely to want to give them education because you assume that it is right. Second issue then, where we get less exploitative religions. The first thing that they said is that we have to defend fundamentalism and like really harmful retribution on our side. If it is a prefers world, the first concept of the world is already tied to human choices. Therefore, all the things like all the moderation argument from their side can exist on our side as well if you believe that the world evolves in that way. But the second rebuttal to this is, even in the hard line where we have to defend retribution, Luigi asked the question of why these kinds of things are always bad. We said that this is good for victims, for the most oppressed that they wanted to protect on their side of the debate. The people who get away on opposition are the most privileged as well because they're not under the circumstance of evil or they're not exposed to temptation as well. But the harm is, you assume that they are already good. You assume that they are inherently good, but they are just so good at hiding their sins, as what the previous speaker agreed to. In a world where we treat the rich and the privileged to have equal weight in terms of the choices and the sins that they can commit that can be attributed to them, there is a world that can demand more accountability. But lastly, they never rebutted to the idea that if you assume that people are automatically good, you have less incentive to make institutions and structures that make it easier for people to do good because you feel that their choices are less empowered because you're not an active chooser and you cannot actively form your life. In a world where we give emphasis on the kinds of choices that people make, you make structures like charities and NGOs more accessible because people are not inherently good and they have to be nudged in that direction. In a world where that is absent, we say the rich and privileged that you allow to that get away on either side are more in a more morally privileged standpoint and opposition. We remove that from the gov when we hold them more accountable based on the choices that they commit to. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Government Whip, and it's time for the Opposition Whip.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, all good.
Give me a second.
was it? আমার জিনিসটা last
Okay, starting my speech.
Attribution of blame to community.
Sorry about that. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to really look through your notes. A big flaw of the government team here is they've run a very stock debate about determinism against free will, as opposed to the specific elements of sin that surround temptation or sin that surrounds individual free will, which means that there is almost a definitive negative attribution of sins to an entity, but there is no direct attribution to the positive to that same entity. I'm going to do 3 things in my speech. First, I'll discuss to you why on an individual perspective, which was a large part of their benefit, where individuals need to feel good about themselves. This does not necessarily add any value. Rather, you ensure individuals feel much worse and communities are isolated. Second, I'll explain to you what the method of rehabilitation on our side actually is, because I would like to point out that all of the comparatives they made were individuals do crime, do bad things, and they never do anything in response. If there is something they do in response, then the benefit that they want to claim is almost definitely marginal. But I would then point out why the retributive aspect that they essentially champion is significantly worse, and why it ensures communities are destroyed. In terms of the first one about determinism and free will, so there are a few things we argued from the very beginning that they ignored. Firstly, individuals on their side inherently feel like they're doing bad. And this is particularly true for vulnerable communities, because the nuance here from Wafi's speech onwards was often people are only doing sin for arbitrary circumstances that are beyond their control, which means when they need to steal to fend for their families, or when they need to go into violent protests just to ensure they're not politically destroyed or not ethnically cleansed, those are scenarios in which these are the most vulnerable individuals who had no choice but to go into those acts of sin. The vast majority of the government case sounds like in the instance where they make this mistake once, their ability to make it like fix it the next time should exist. I would point to you, the vast majority of vulnerable individuals have no ability to change it even the next time, which means the only way to protect these people is by not making them feel like they're criminals throughout their entire life. First thing, they did not engage to. Second thing, in terms of individual feeling, Sajid explained to you why often you create agency through individuals, individual autonomy, their genetics, the communities they belong to, arbitrary factors you assign to identities, and then tie this to the sin that they commit. I would like to posit that this ensures that these groups of people are always going to be eliminated from the scope of acceptance, because they are at fault as opposed to the devil being at fault, which gives a middle ground for you to actually ensure these individuals are not isolated from communities. These are the 2 things they did not engage to, which means the amount of negative harm created in individuals' lives, particularly the most vulnerable, is massive throughout their entire case. What they did argue was 2 things. Individuals should be able to feel good about good things that they do. This is essentially a dichotomy they created for themselves, because I would like to argue that there is no comparison of the good in this debate. It is quite a strange logic that if you know you do bad and you are able to take agency for it, only then can you also know that you did good and you could take agency for that. The comparison is, on our side, if you do bad, there is a devil's temptation, but on both sides, there is not some other actor that is determining good and is gone on their side. The difference is that the good is the same on both sides, where things like going to heaven or doing good for people still act as motivation for you to do good and make you feel good. That is therefore not exclusive. The last thing they say is that you have the ability to ask for forgiveness for God. I would like to suggest that you can do this on both sides. One, because the devil taking control of your actions is still reason for you to ask for forgiveness. The difference is God's forgiveness is always spiritual and arbitrary. You have no idea if he forgave you or not, but you have a higher probability of forgiving yourself when you believe that the devil's temptation is what led to your actions as opposed to your own faults, which means because you don't color yourself as vulnerable and bad from the beginning, your ability to individually feel accepted and away from sin is much higher in a world where you do not assign all of it to direct agency. So from an individual perspective, largely, the good is extremely marginal on their side at best, but for the vast majority of people, life becomes significantly worse, so every day you feel bad. The comparison then was, in a world where you have the devil as the temptation for sin, is it possible for any retributive action to be there? We argue here that it is extremely important for religious institutions and individual people to feel like they're keeping the devil at bay. That is why, even if it is the case that you are not directly responsible, you want to tarnish the factors which ensures the devil becomes powerful in those regions. Sajid clearly makes this analysis, which is why when you see that there is a lot of sin, you are likely to invest in those very places to increase education, the amount of welfare, to ensure religious presence increases. It is not to suggest that if you are individual actors who are doing bad, it is easier for these communities to let you go, to excommunicate you, rather than fixing the community at large, which means when individual instances of wrongdoing wrongdoing happen, there are individual instances of justice. On our side, there are structural incentives for you to actually improve communities at large, which is the rehabilitative action we prefer, because that has a much higher threshold for doing good. But lastly, if you are a person who feels like the devil got the better of you, you want to make up to God as well, because you feel bad that you are in that position. So while it doesn't mean you fully take blame, it still means a lot of rehabilitative action happens anyway. So if the comparison is then clear, what is their main argument? People in positions of power can commit crimes and essentially get away with it. The reason why we said this argument is the least important in this debate, because on either side, even if they take blame or even if the devil's temptation acts on them, these individuals have limited consequences because they can hide their crimes. They can interpret religion differently to tell you that their agency was not the superseding factor, or they're likely to be less likely to be distrusted and therefore called out in all circumstances. They misinterpret this argument in a way that makes it seem like, oh, only if there is free will, you are able to do these things, and you can hide them in a world where devil's temptation agrees. But I would say they can do it on both sides. Therefore, this is not the major stake of the debate. On both sides, these individuals are likely to continue doing certain bad things. The real question then is, are the people who are victims of these exact people getting better forms of justice, and on which side is that achieved? Before I answer this question that they never engage to, POI.
Capacity to create structures that make it easier to do good is with the people in power. So if you agree that they are seen as free from sin because they are less tempted, why would they change these structures for the poor?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that this is not entirely up to those people. What it means is, for example, you have a country in which a lot of sin comes from the poor areas. Is it likely that the church will forsake that area itself? But no, the church is afraid that the devil is gaining precedence and therefore has a direct incentive to move into those areas and help them get rid of the devil. This has nothing to do with the individual incentives of the people in positions of power. It's simply what the entire institution functions as. But then what did they ignore in this entire process? Two things. Number one, people's natural progression is cut off the point at which you blame all of their minor changes, which may be perceived as sins, as the fault of their own, where they're treated as kafirs and people who think they're better than God, rather than people who had made a mistake, which allows them to make those choices, which allows them to liberalize and actually gain progression and acceptance. I argued from the very first debate, and these are vulnerable individuals who have nothing to do with the overall benefit of religion and are only being harmed by it. These are people you lose out on their side. But the last thing I would suggest is, we argued about why the type of retributive narrative that are spread in fatwas in a world where you only assign blame on individual agency is significantly worse, because it leads to coercive actions across the vast majority of a religion-dominated world, where you think you are greater than God, you are immediately forsaken, versus a rehabilitative one, where vulnerable individuals who have no choice in the crimes they commit are actively forgiven and given a scope for rehabilitation. If that is the world we create, we are definitely winning this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's time for reply speeches, starting with up reply.
Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Cool. I'd posit the best case scenario of Gov is some immoral people do not get the full brunt of their punishment. And maybe in some world, you believe they've proven it, which we've systematically given you multiple reasons not to believe. Even if you do that, there was no response to why, even if these people are immoral, they deserve to have their limbs chopped off. Intuitively, that's not something that any human should believe in. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Muslims across the world do. Unfortunately, the vast majority of countries in which this debate will have to apply are societies with religious elites and clerics that can use this narrative to politically influence justice, either on a state level in that way or in local communities. The worst case scenario, which there was absolutely no defense for, was literally having poor people who steal never being able to touch anything again. Unless they defend that in some way in the reply speech, they're not winning this debate. What's the debate about them? The first is vulnerable individuals and protection. We argued that the most vulnerable individuals in this debate are those who are victims of circumstance, either because they've been born into a religion that they never chose, or because they're slowly starting to deviate from that religion, but need a protection or a safe space to operate in. This usually looks like a vulnerable individual needing that extra 3 years where they're not outright prosecuted or excommunicated, or having the ability to have some degree of operation or carrying out activities on a spectrum which people are less vitriolic to because they see it as the devil doing it rather than themselves. Because of that rehabilitative nature, a vast number of women all across Southeast Asia and South Asia have been able to get rid of the hijab. A vast number of LGBTQ individuals in India are slowly trying to take precedence in Muslim-dominated areas like Punjab. What this does is it removes the ability for scope for any of that change to happen, or even if it happens, makes individuals perpetually feel really terrible, where you have to choose between religion or choose between the other kinds of things that you want to explore. There was absolutely zero engagement from any of the speakers on government to this part of the debate. These people witnessed this debate anyway. Where did they contest? They contested on justice and how some privileged individuals get away with it. We didn't try to defend this. We said, of course, there will be some privileged individuals that do crime, but largely speaking, the structures through which we operate will not change in either world, and therefore them being perceived as sinners will not be any different. It is very likely that the vast majority of sinners are likely to be poor individuals. This is because of the information hegemony of the rich. This is because of the interpretation power of religious individuals, or because of the threshold through which the vast majority of people operate in disbelieving a particular person. They never responded to this and proved why the vast majority of people outed will be those in positions of power and not those who are victims of these individuals. Then we argued, even if these people are caught in their world, the way in which their blame will be attributed is to individuals, and maybe excommunicating that one individual will happen. That's a best case scenario of Gov. What they never proved is why that's a worthy trade-off, because the trade-off is removing the biggest evil in the world, which all religious institutions are structurally trying to remove from the most vulnerable societies. That leads to investment, that leads to decentralization. But the third mitigatory response we gave you was these individuals themselves will also want forgiveness from God, and therefore, because of the positive incentives of religion, will always try to do good. The do good version of this debate was massively misconstrued by Gov because they debate on a free will versus deterministic debate, which is just not this motion, and you should not buy the analysis they give you. What that means is we have far more justice on our side for the most vulnerable, even if some individuals from the privileged are not caught and are not punished. Number one, the punishment would be too severe even for them. Number two, the vast majority of these people would not be caught anyway. Number three, it's a worthy trade-off because we help the most vulnerable in the process. I don't see any way in which Gov can win this debate.
For that speech, and it's time for the last speech of the debate, the government reply speech.
Hello, testing the microphone. Can I be heard properly?
Yes, all good.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. So in any prefers a world motion, we need to ask, what type of world does opposition actually want? And that's the only question I'm gonna focus on in this speech. Look at their end goals at opposition. They said that we want to protect people from the devil by giving them education, by protecting them from the rich power structures in the world, by alleviating suffering from the poor as dictated by the church, by faith, and by God. And they said they want rehabilitation to stop moral evil from happening and stop people from committing mistakes and tend them towards the good. So it is not only just a matter of changing the choices and intentions of individuals, but remember, their entire conception of sin and good is dependent on changing how individuals keep the devil at bay. And I think that if that is the conception of this debate, it definitely is an understanding of how much choice do individuals have to do the good and how much choice do individuals have to do evil. And that is exactly why their entire reframing of this being the least important issue or not the most important issue or just being a wash in general just fails in terms of strategy of making them win. Because if all of their arguments are contingent on rehabilitating individuals and making faith faith-based organizations fair for more and more people, that fairness in a just world is contingent on not just relying on a God, relying on a church, or relying on confession, or relying on a sacrament or forgiveness. It has to be contingent on something more. And we said that more is dependent on people taking control over themselves and over their own destiny and over their own ability to do good and be able to punish evil and reward good more and more instead. Because all of the examples of the previous speaker in saying that people could disassociate from the oppressive religious structures are actually dependent on people taking control over their lives and knowing that they can do good fully and freely because of themselves, and they are able to reject evil, not because of a devil that exists or not because of a church that approves or gives them permission, but because they did it themselves. What I want to prove in this speech is very simple. We prove that this motivation is oppressive for people for the following reasons. Number one, in the formation of religious structures and organized religions, because it's a historical debate, it happens over time, it's a prefers a world motion, it is in these churches and in this God that dictates how overwhelming the devil is and how the motivations on what the motivations of the devil are, because only God can know what the devil is, only God can know what the devil does. And when people are not in control of that devil, they are helpless and cannot do much to go away and reject that devil, because they can fail, and they can fail really, really hard, and especially when they are not as faithful as other individuals. That is what this is disempowering in this debate. That is exactly what makes individuals helpless and more susceptible to the vulnerabilities of their conditions. When on our side we said even in people in worse conditions have an agency, or at least some exercise of agency for themselves to be able to do the good, because they are fully in control of it, and it's not independent of whether or not a devil is always going to watch over them like some big brother and changing whatever they do, like a candy bar or whatever, that they're going to do good or bad all the time. Two, in relation to power structures, which they just dismissed as just being symmetric because good is not part of this debate, we said that the conception of the human is that they are inherently good on their side. Because of course this debate is about good. Religions are all about defining morality and defining what the good is. So if that is the case, we said the debate has to be about creating and forming what a just world is, and what a just religion is, and what a just God should be, and how we should impose just structures over individuals, over other people. So they can't just say our case is just about fundamentalism and just about punishing and rewarding in general, but it is about trying to understand the conception of justice on the basis of faith, and not just on the basis of individuality or whatever a church or a God dictates that for individuals. So to the extent that organized religions will be oppressive in both sides of the house and they want more followers, we give more people control over that religion, and therefore that is good independent of itself, because communities can check each other, people can check each other, because it is people that commit evil and not just the devil alone. For all this and more, we have to win at golf.
Thank you very much for that speech and for the debate as a whole. I would like to ask to turn down recording and all of the participants, including observers, to leave the Zoom call to let panel make their ballots and the decision